So in a few days, it will be Thanksgiving, and we have many things to be thankful for. And those of us who are lucky enough to have family and friends around will be gathered around the table and having a nice feast. And a part of that feast will be bread. And if you had a chance to read some of the quips in the inside of the bulletin, there is one person who said bread is the king of the table. Recently on Facebook, I read the really touching obituary that Greg Pings and his family had written to honor his mother. And in it, he mentioned how she made this wonderful homemade bread, and they would eat it warm, dripping with butter and honey. Sounds wonderful. Something to remember. And it made me think a little bit about my experience making bread. Back when our kids were younger, and I was in my super mom phase, you know, when you're trying to be all things to all people, and I decided I should make bread for Easter morning breakfast. Now, I had never made bread, and my mother never made bread, so I know nothing about it except I knew that yeast is one of the main ingredients. So I purchased all this stuff and I mixed it together, and I don't know how many of you have made bread, but it seems like it's a fairly complex situation. You have to knead it at just the amount of right of time, and then you let it rest in just the right temperature for just the right amount of time. And I did all that, and I did it again and again. It took me a good part of the day. And I made these lovely little rolls, and when I took them out of the oven, they were beautiful. But guess what? They were dry, they were dense, and they were tasteless. And I had to throw them all away. And those of you who know me know I hate waste, and I hate throwing things away. So that day, yeast and I parted company forever. Another little bread thing I think about is the bread machine. I don't know if any of you ever had one of those, but there was a time a while back where that was a very popular item. And it was marketed for the kids to give dad. And I knew several families that the kids gave it to dad, and I knew one dad who actually made really wonderful bread with it. In our family, Dad told the kids, under no circumstances are you to give me a bread machine. And so they didn't. And so whenever we need bread, we go to the store. Now, bread is relatively inexpensive. And it is one of the staples of diet for people without financial security. It has been called the staff of life. And people in biblical times lived in a subsistence economy, and they knew the importance of bread. And bread is mentioned often in the Bible as both as something to eat and as a symbol of things. So the first story you heard was the Exodus story, which again is one that you've heard many times. And in it, Moses led the people out of Egypt, out of their slavery, their bondage. And instead of being joyful at their newfound freedom, they complained and they whined. And maybe justifiably so, because they were hungry. And they said, well, when we were in Egypt, we had plenty to eat. So God told Moses that he would provide food for them, and he did. He provided meat in the evening with the quail, the game birds, and then in the morning he provided a substance that they could find and gather. But there was one little caveat that they weren't too crazy about. He said, only gather as much as you need for one day for your family. Just gather your daily bread and no more. And of course, some of them said, he's got to be kidding. No, I'm going to gather as much as I want, and maybe I'll have some more in the morning. But what they found out was it had spoiled in the morning, and it smelled bad. And if you've ever kept leftovers a little bit too long, you know what that was like. It said that, in the verse, it said that they ate this diet for 40 years. And I'm thinking, 40 years, that's a long time. And I also read that sometimes time in the Bible is a little different than time as we know it. But the important thing is God provided what they needed for the day. Also, consider the petition that we make every time we say the Lord's Prayer. We ask, give us this day our daily bread. We don't ask for feed me for the rest of my life or for a week or for a month. This day, our daily bread. And also notice we don't say, give me my bread that I need. Give us. Because we people of God, we're in this together. The second lesson was from the feeding of the 5,000. And every time I hear it, I hear something a little different. I take away a little something different. And this time I thought about how tricky Jesus was. I mean, he knew what he was going to do, but he asked the disciples, whatever are we going to do? And of course, they were clueless. I don't know, but he knew. There was this boy with the basket with the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And with that, they fed 5,000 people. Really? That's a lot. That's a miracle for sure. I'm not the only person that has wondered about that, because I've read there are scholars who've written things about maybe this is what happened. And one of my favorite explanations comes from a pastor, John Miller, who was our pastor when we were in Hilton Head in the winter at the chapel. And this is the story that he suggests that he had also heard from another pastor. He says, no Jewish mother in that crowd of people would ever have gone off to listen to Jesus without bringing some bread to eat for her children, her husband, and herself. You can't be a qualified Jewish mother, says he, if you neglect such an important maternal prerequisite. So Jesus asked everybody in that large gathering to turn in everything they had to eat, which they did, and there was more than enough to feed everyone. So whatever the story is, the importance is the miracle of sharing. Now, another pastor that has influenced me through the years, his name is Bob Naylor, and he was the pastor here in this church. Actually, 50 years ago, when we first came, it was his first Sunday to be senior pastor here. And this church has always meant a lot to him, and he comes back every once in a while. And he also attended the chapel down there in South Carolina when we were there. He spoke often about the symbolism of the table. Now, we have communion here every month, and we talk about the communion table, gathering around the table. I have a favorite communion hymn, and it's called, Let Us Break Bread Together on Our Knees. Now, my knees are suggesting that I skip that part of it, but the bread, breaking the bread together is what's important. Doing this as a church is something that we're good at. The potluck supper. The council, every month when they meet, they offer a potluck lunch, fellowship luncheon, and everybody's invited. And it's a nice time to be together around the table and sharing our food. We also, of course, have coffee hour after church every Sunday. And here again, we gather around the table and share our thoughts and our stories, our cares and our concerns, and our time being together. We also have our Friday night when we have, once a month, we have a movie night. And here again, everybody's invited. And we have a wonderful meal, and we have an inspirational movie that we talk about. And we have a lot of people there from the community as well as from our church. And everyone is invited. And if you've never come, I encourage you to do it. The pastor in Hilton Head, John Miller, he suggested that maybe the world leaders might take a leaf from churches and throw a big potluck dinner for all the world leaders and have them all bring something from their country and share a meal and share fellowship. Would that might be so. There are 900 million people in the world who are hungry because of a lack of food. But there are many others that even with an abundance are hungry for something else. The hunger is to be fed spiritually. It's been suggested that perhaps we could find a recipe for dealing with that hunger from the master chef. Maybe such a recipe would include the following 4 ingredients. 1, contentment with our daily bread. Contentment with enough for the day. And 2, participate in the miracle of sharing. And not just sharing food or stuff, but sharing our time to listen, to be there as a supportive presence. The 3rd ingredient could be, as Bob Naylor called it, commitment to the table, being together, not just me, but us together. And the 4th ingredient, when we're feeling empty, refer to that quote from the book of John, chapter 6, verse 35. Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry." Amen.